Well, hello and welcome to another week of the TRG webinar series. I am Kahlil Philander. I'm an assistant professor at Washington State University. I am a co-host of this program along with Sally Gainsbury from the University of Sydney. And supporting all of this is the Brain and Mind Center, including Herschenstein behind the scenes. Today we have another very interesting webinar ahead for you, and to introduce today's topic and our guest, here is Sally Gainsbury.
Thank you, Kahlil. I'm Sally Gainsbury. I'm from the University of Sydney, and I'm delighted to introduce our guest today, who is Laura Da Silva from SG Certified and the founder of Digital RG. She is an expert on sustainability. And as this webinar is titled Technology, Risk and Gambling, we do tend to focus on risk thinking about gambling harms, but it's a much broader conversation than that, including environmental sustainability and other factors. So I'm really excited to have Laura here today to talk us through these different aspects of sustainability for the gambling industry. So, Laura, I was hoping you could start by talking about how you've come to see sustainability and potentially busting some of the myths or talking about some of the discourse or lack of agreement across the field.
Sure, no problem. So I actually started my career in sustainability in South Africa. I was working with South African companies, helping these companies thinking about how to be successful from a financial point of view. And in South Africa at the time, many years ago, there was a law that forced companies to also report on their environmental and social impact. And I thought that made complete sense. You can't really see that a company is doing well if you don't consider their environmental cost of operating, the social cost of operating, and of course then the financial, let's say, reward. So for me, sustainability is how a company can do well. So whatever your success measure is, by having a positive environmental and social impact. And that's really what it is for me. And that's what we are hopefully seeing more coming into the discussion at the moment.
Laura, the term ESG has gone through some battles in terms of how it's viewed. And I think a lot of people probably are only exposed to this term and the idea in very brief windows. I remember a couple of years ago, there was a big splash when Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan and the CEO Roundtable said that it would be a priority for their organizations.
Beautiful words.
For someone who isn't, steeped in all of this like you are, what's the right way to think about this part of business practice and kind of where it belongs in management thinking as well as stakeholders outside of industry?
I think it's important to understand all these different terms. So you have ESG, which means environmental, social governance. You have sustainability. You have corporate social responsibility, people, planet, profit. There's as many terms as you can think of. It's crazy. So we need, I think, to come back down to understanding what is the intention behind. And so when you think about ESG, ESG was actually created by the financial services industry to try to understand, to try to put a value on a company from an environmental, social, and governance perspective. But what they care about, really, when you think about ESG, is what is the potential impact that environmental or social change or governance issues could have on the financial success of the organization. So it's really, the way it was created was really one way. I'm worried about my assets. I'm worried about my money. If there's a flood, or if there's social unrest, or if there's bribery within a company, then how can this impact ultimately my money? So the ESG started like this. And sustainability, the idea of sustainability is that it's two ways. It's two ways. So it's, what are those changes or impact on the environment, social governance, and so on? How can they impact your business? But it's also, what is the impact of your business on society and the environment? So in gambling, of course, you can think of safer gambling, problem gambling, match fixing, You can think of a lot of different issues from a social point of view. You can also think from an environmental point of view. If you operate casinos, you can think of the building, energy, and so on. So that's what is the impact of the company on the environment and society. And then the other way around, if you think you run a casino in a place that is devastated by flooding, for example, then what is the impact on your business? Are you going to lose money, and are you going to be impacted? So it's really, sustainability tries to look at two ways. And that's, I would say, the basic definition of sustainability, if that makes sense. Oh God, have I lost
That
you?
does make sense. And I think people are starting to be more familiar with environmental sustainability and the expectation that companies are looking to reduce their carbon footprint. That's the sort of the common understanding. What are the metrics that are typically discussed in terms of sustainability?
So when you think about sustainability, it's really anything that can ultimately impact your business or impact society and the environment. So it's extremely broad. So again, match fixing is part of it. Well-being of employees, diversity and inclusion, environmental impact is part of it. So it's really broad. It's just about having a good business model. But if you just drill down to that element of environment, here there's a lot of things that need to be considered. Again, what is the impact of the company on the environment? So yes, carbon. Carbon is one very important thing that we need to address, but it's not the only thing. What about water? What about biodiversity? What about paper? If you think of national lotteries, for example, they produce or they use a lot of paper that is being distributed. What about paper? What about the usage of chemicals in the products that are being produced? What about transportation? So there's a huge number of different areas that need to be considered. Yes, carbon and carbon equivalent is critical for ultimately the survival of our species. We need to reduce by 50% carbon emissions by 2030 on a baseline of 2021. That needs to happen very quickly, and it's not happening, unfortunately, but there's a lot of other elements also that a company needs to consider.
So you brought up a lot of different areas that relate to this topic. And I recall, my time at BCLC, we spent a fair bit of time thinking about materiality of different issues to our business. And I know you have a fairly diverse client base. And so I'm curious about how you or they or some sort of mixture of the two of you think about materiality from the perspective of what are the key issues that the gambling industry actually cares about, and sort of what are perhaps lower priority things, either from an internal stakeholder standpoint or an external stakeholder standpoint, that perhaps you think should be elevated and people should be more interested in.
Yeah, so first of all, that term materiality, I am very lucky to work in many different industry, many different countries, and it's important to understand really materiality. Some people say it's really obviously what are the different issues that are material or could have a material impact to the business or to the environment and society. So what is really meaningful? So you can't do everything. You can't tackle every single issues. So you usually try to prioritize what are the issues where you have the most influence on and the most impact on, and what are those that could really influence how you run your business as well. So currently, or in the past, if we just look at this environmental piece, I heard time and time and time again from the financial services industry, the gambling industry, that the environment is not so important to the industry because they are not a factory, or they're not really in an intensive industry. That was wrong at the time, but we accepted it. Now it's not accepted anymore. Environmental impact is critical, and it's not just about what is your environmental impact, on the environment that you can reduce or try to get into the net positive, but it's also what kind of resources do you have at your finger, what can you influence to actually go beyond your environmental impact. So I'll just take an example. We did an article with poker.org recently about environmental impact, and it's trying to think, okay, if you run a poker tournament, is there a way that you try to educate poker players, anyone who watches at the same time, around environmental issues? Or is there a way that when you do an advertisement, you don't showcase, that, I don't know, driving a petrol car is the ultimate idea of a success? Or how can you embed this as part of what you do? And how can you really put environmental impact as in everything that you do? Because I'll just finish on that point, but if we look at safer gambling, it's critical. It has disastrous effect if it's not dealt with. But this impacts 5, 10, 15% sometimes of a population, depending on the methodology, of course. The environmental impact piece impacts 100% of your stakeholders, 100% of the population. So everybody needs to come together to work on it.
That's a really good outline, and I'm keen to get into the other aspects. I hadn't thought about, well-being and the bigger picture. But if we do keep on environment for the moment, when you work with companies, what do you recommend as sort of the first place to start? Are there a couple of easy big wins you can have, or are there bigger things to focus on, whether it's, solar panels or stopping single-use plastic? Where should the industry look for their first wins, and what are the things that they need to invest more time and resources to get in the long as they need a bit more work to develop towards?
Yeah, I would say step one is you can't do anything about what you don't know is happening. So you need to measure and understand, number one, what is your environmental impact? And number two, what are potentially the ways you could have a positive environmental impact? So step one is understand your carbon emission. That's critical. Understand if, for example, if you are online, like the servers, where are they located? Are they located in places that have, low, more environmentally friendly ways to deal with servers? Try to understand everything about your business, not just you, but try also to understand your suppliers. What are their environmental impact, then you, and then your players. So try to think about the entire life cycle. So number one, understand. And when you do that exercise, and there's lots of tools to help you do that exercise, you will identify which are those areas where you will have the quicker wins and the places where you can really make great gains. So for some companies, it might be looking at travels and trying to optimize travel, or trying to do this in a more thoughtful way. For other companies, it might be switching their paper supplier, or the supplier that provides their paper. But the step one, and you need the data. You need to understand what is your company, what can your company do, and what is the impact of your company.
Laura, one of the things that I've seen on the reporting side around these issues is that, and perhaps this is this is more idiosyncratic than anything, but what I've noticed, it seems like the organizations that have stronger credit ratings are the ones that tend to have a more robust program and reporting around these issues. Is there a connection between the finance side of these organizations and their ESG reporting?
That's a very difficult question, because if the ESG or sustainability reporting were all good and trustworthy and doing with methodologies that I trust, I'm sure we would find some relationship between how successful a company is in the long term with this. But unfortunately, there's just very different types of reporting. And it's the same, I think, when we look at prevalent studies around problem gambling, lots of different methodologies, and it's really hard to compare between one and another. So there is a lot of people who do say that if a company is really transparent when it comes to environmental, social governance, then it's reflected in the fact that they have better relationship with investors. Their employees tend to be happier, more proud to work for the company, and there's more trust in the company. It makes the relationship with stakeholders easier. But it really depends, because out there's also, specifically in this industry, there's a lot of reporting that are more, I would call it, advertising brochures about the great things that they do, and they forget all the other parts that should be measured, should be reported on. So, yeah.
There's so much here, and I was going to ask you about the kind of greenwashing element, and it's in my mind, I think it's similar to sort of hotels we see, where they can say one thing and do another. And the gambling industry is so diverse. In Australia, we have a huge legal gambling industry and many, many different stakeholders. And as you say, really importantly, the suppliers, everyone who makes the carpet and the chairs, to the servers. There's so many different aspects of it. If we kind of break down in your mind, are there different segments, whether it's, people who are running races or, online operators, casinos and venues with a physical presence, obviously, but and lotteries. Can you kind of break down a little bit where you see some of the key issues, maybe unique to gambling, as opposed to just a general sort of venue operation or other non-gambling supplier?
Sure. I mean, if we look at horse racing, for example, if we take the broad sustainability agenda, obviously the well-being of horses is something that's rising in the attention of, I think, the public, the media, and also is becoming more and more important. But also, the travels, a huge amount of travels, employee well-being. So there's a lot of issues that are very specific to horse racing and betting on horses. When it comes to sports betting, of course, match fixing, prevention, crime in sports, governance of the whole sports industry, and then, of course, safer gambling and environmental impact when it comes to tournaments. I mean, the idea of doing, for example, tournaments across multiple continents, which was an idea, is just absolutely insane when we're in an environmental crisis. Then when you think about lotteries, so obviously lotteries are very diverse now. They don't just operate lotto or typical draw-based games. They also sometimes operate venues. They also operate sports betting sometimes. But if we look at the traditional draw-based games type of lotto, kind of lottery types, paper, waste, water, and elements of travel is really critical from an environmental point of view, but also, of course, the kind of idea around employee well-being, recruiting the best talents is very important, diversity, inclusion, and so on. Does that answer your question? I'm curious, I'll ask you some questions back. So, Kahlil, you said you work for BCLC. What were the kind of critical material issues that they were looking at within their reports that you thought maybe made sense, or what was your thinking?
I mean, it's pretty much the major sins of the gambling industry. So that was, problem gambling and crime, and the crime side being mostly related to money laundering. I think was the most material issue while I was at BCLC during that time period when the Vancouver model of money laundering was quite in the news during that time. But then, I think some of the things you brought up were also identified, like paper being a really big one on the lottery side, as far as the material issues. But yeah.
One thing that I find is, so we did a test some time ago where we advertised the exactly same job, but said one was for a gambling company and one was for another company. One had, I think, about 5 different answers. The other one had about 85. You can guess which one had the least answers. It was the gambling industry. And I think that for the companies, and I'm seeing it a lot in lotteries, that start to really think about sustainability as a whole, start to showcase that, they operate in principle to give back to community, to give back to society through good causes, but they also, the way they operate should be done properly. I think it also helps make a case for people to want to work for them. And I think that's one of the key difference, I would say, between kind of state national lotteries versus perhaps other parts of the gambling industry that still have that reputation of being associated with the different sins that you mentioned, for example.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think if you look at industries that are as profitable as, say, for example, the casino gaming industry has been in the past, perhaps maybe a bit less so now, but certainly on the online gaming side, they tend to just be a magnet for talent. But they're definitely, like, if you think about say, for example, the major MBA programs in the United States, or probably in the UK as well, I would guess, they struggle to attract that talent to the industry. And, I have a friend who graduated maybe a decade ago from the Harvard MBA program, and I think it was Gary Loveman who had come in to do a guest lecture at one point in time, and he was basically just peppered about these types of issues that you work on every day, Laura. So I think what you described about the recruitment issue is definitely a very material issue for gaming companies.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, I think oil, gambling, and a few other industry have to pay much, much more in order to recruit talent or, good people. And if perhaps there was, and this is perhaps a little bit idealistic and naive, but if there was a rethinking of the business model to really incorporate those measures of how do we make money? Do we make money? What is the cost of operating? What is the cost to society? What is the cost to the environment for us to operate? And to be really, having the intent of being a net positive contributor to society and the environment, I think there's a lot of other things that would happen or that would be better. So perhaps the press wouldn't have such an issue with the industry. Perhaps people would be much prouder to say that they work for those companies at a barbecue with their friends. And perhaps as well, they would identify new ways to make money that's, that perhaps is aligned with doing something positive for society. But that's perhaps me being a little bit naive, although I see this sometimes.
Have you seen any evidence of that in perhaps some of the smaller Nordic countries that have been more progressive in their
I'm actually going to take an example of not too far from you, from California. I'm going to mention, I don't know if you've heard of the Chumash casino. That rings a bell.
It sounds familiar.
I believe it's in California, but this is one of the casinos that we have a case study on our site that's open, so feel free to have a look. But they looked at their environmental impact in a brilliant way. So number one, they're owned by a tribe that wants to leave a positive impact on the planet. But that's not how it started. It actually started with the team of cleaners who realized that there was huge amount of waste, and they started thinking by themselves, how can we reduce waste? And it started there. And then the team got really excited to do their job because they could see that they were having an impact on waste. And then they looked at solar panels. Then they looked at the water. How was it cleaned after being used? Then they looked at biodiversity, and it became this whole great thing, still not perfect, but absolutely brilliant thing that brought value to employees. They reduce a huge amount of cost to the operation, and it makes people really proud to work for the company, and they get some clients who hear about their environmental practices and do come there. So that's just one example in casinos, and yes, in the Nordics, there's a few good examples as well.
Thank you for sharing that example. I do note that both in the Nordics and in that example, it's not as much of a public shareholder, profit driven. There are some other aspects to the ownership model. So I'm curious potentially to look at this idea of examples where you're taking into account the profitability, which is obviously for publicly listed companies, but where you see in your expertise where companies really should be pivoting towards, because I from my experience, I often find it frustrating to say, well, this actually would be better for you as an industry. It would be more sustainable. You'd have better, customer loyalty and lifelong
Mhm.
customer experience, but there's a short-sightedness, obviously, of the person in charge or the team currently in charge. If with
Mhm.
your expertise, and if you could design, even if it was a publicly listed company, what were the things you would start doing differently?
Oh my God, in this industry, there's a lot, and we try. But I would say I think the first step, as I mentioned, was just to really truly be honest about the impact that the company is having, and also the potential and the great power that some of those companies have, and perhaps are not being used in ways that would be really beneficial for both the company and society or the environment. So I would start by really being honest about it and not trying to hide. Um, so you mentioned greenwashing before. Greenwashing is not just about lying about green credential, but it's also saying, "Oh, look at this wonderful green thing that we do," and then trying to hide or not being honest about other things that are being done in the rest of the company, and just trying to promote one tiny thing. So my first step would be, let's be honest. Let's do a proper assessment of your company. How does it make money? What are your objectives and goals? And how can we maximize success by having a positive environmental and social impact? If we are smart enough, if we're creative enough, we'll figure out a way. It's not always it's not just always about cutting costs or trying to oversell to people who have issues. There's different smarter ways to make money, and so that would be my first step. Understand truly your business, be honest about your business. And then second, I probably would fire a lot of those CEOs who are just short-sighted and just think about their job as a 2 or 3 year cycle, and don't truly care about companies in 5, 10 years, and the result of their company. So if I had that power, maybe I would do that too. So
It's interesting that you talk about increased transparency because that's obviously something that us as researchers advocate for a lot, especially data hungry researchers. I'll ask a little bit of a loaded question. Have you ever heard of anyone getting in trouble for over disclosing within their reporting? Like, has this, like, because I can't think of any high profile examples of people that have,
I
or organizations that have disclosed and gotten in trouble, but surely there must be some example somewhere.
yeah I would say that however perfect the company is trying to be, they'll always get criticism. I would say, and they might get some things wrong, and but no, I can't think of the top of my head. I'm just thinking the first example that came to my mind. I don't know if you saw, that was Apple doing a short video about their environmental impact, and they used this incredible Hollywood actress, I forgot her name, but to pretend that she was Mother Nature, and then talking about the different environmental impact that Apple has, and it was really great. It was really interesting, but the way they reported, they were using data that no one would understand. So if you use gigabytes of, or I don't know, like gigatons of carbon, or that kind of measure, people can't understand. So yes, it's about reporting, but then it's also about how do you explain that data. You're not just saying, here's the things where we're not great, but then it's also about welcoming feedback, and putting a plan together to really address those issues. But yes, to first answer, no, I don't know. I can't think of any company that got in trouble for over reporting, as long as the reporting was truthful. So
I'm going to ask this question maybe to Sally and Laura. Do you think if a gaming company came out and said that, say, for example, 30% of their revenue came from people who were having problems with gambling, um,
mhm.
what do you think the blowback from that would be? And would it be short-lived, or would that materially impact their business for years to come? Because I think that number is probably right for some firms.
I mean, if you talk about problem gambling, let's talk also about money laundering, even if, if we extend to that as well, for some companies. I don't know if Sally, if you want to take that answer first, or.
Well, I'm going to give the example of Philander, which I think just this week released its regular reported figure of 3% of money coming from gambling, people with gambling problems. I think that's off the top of my head, so I can double check that, but it's online. But they regularly disclose, I'm not sure exactly how they work it out, probably using their identified harm players potentially, but they do regularly report it, and I think that's really brave, because it is quite unique as far as I'm aware of the industry. I think it demonstrates the success of their programs, because I suspect in many other aspects it is much higher than that, but closer to the 30% figure. So I applaud industry where there are these examples of transparency, because it does, as you say, Laura, allow this benchmarking of saying where things are going, and yes, maybe that we're at this level, but we have a goal towards this level, and that level of transparency, I think, is amazing and very impressive, and very rare in the industry.
Yeah, I agree. So Svenska Spel, or I think the French as well. I think there's quite a few lotteries who have started to use behavior analytics, and starting to use the data that they get through that, and trying to report. I think Kindred has done it. But yes, if we don't understand the full methodology, what they leave out sometimes, then it's imperfect, but it is brave. I think also, so it's about, for me, reporting the data, being transparent, and then sharing practices, sharing what has been tried, maybe didn't work, sharing, things that have worked, and trying to think beyond your own company, and trying to make the whole industry progress. And so Svenska Spel is not a perfect company, but they've done a lot. They have a lot of pressure from the media, a lot of pressure from the governments, and that also helps them, I think, go into the right direction. So perhaps we need to put a similar level of pressure on others as well, maybe.
And I want to talk
do you believe
about
that 3% number, though? That seems like it's like back of the envelope.
I'd have to go and fact check myself on that one.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'll
Because I mean,
look it up and see if I can put the link.
Let's say you assume that 1% of the population, like the general population, has problems, which is, maybe on the low end, but that's probably, if people that actually participate in gambling, that's probably 3% right there. So that you're kind of assuming that someone with problems is spending the exact same amount as the average of every other customer, which
I
I'd be
think
pretty skeptical about the number.
We would need to see exactly that, because also, so yes, they operate, for example, national lottery tickets, so like draw-based game types, but they also operate casinos, although they've done some really interesting things, putting the customer first in Sweden. So I think they've closed some casinos at different times for reasons related to safer gambling. They've put different technologies at the tables as well, in order to measure behavior. So I think Sweden and Svenska Spel have been forced to, or willingly, but they've done some great things. Then whether the 3% number is for all games, for everything, and that's that would be interesting to look at.
Yeah, we have to fact check that 3% number too. And thank you for saving us and saying all those nice things so that we don't get sued by the government of Sweden. We appreciate that. Laura, I know that you also do, in addition to your work around ESG, you also do work around the WLA, the World Lottery Association certification program. Would you mind just, because I know a lot of people don't necessarily know about that program. Would you mind just giving us like a 10,000-foot view of what the WLA is and the certification program?
Yeah, so the WLA is the World Lottery Association. So I don't work for them, but I help companies achieve the various certifications that WLA has set. You also have, for example, the European Lottery Association, who also have its own certifications and standards around safer gambling and around sustainability. So there's a lot of different certifications out there. There's 45, I believe, safer gambling certifications out there that exist. For WLA, they have 180 state and national lotteries that are members of the association. And what they're trying to do is to say, okay, when you become a member, you have to commit to looking at safer gambling and making it an issue. And that's what they call level 1. So you commit. Then you have 3 other levels. Level 2, it's about creating a gap analysis, understanding about your practices, your business, understanding where you perhaps have gaps when it comes to your responsible gaming or safer gambling practices. Level 3, it's about having an action plan that really addresses those gaps. And level 4, it's about monitoring the effectiveness of your safer gambling practices and showing continuous improvements, really ensuring that you prevent harm and that you also prevent minors from playing. And they also extend also to other sustainability topics. And so the way we work with WLA is basically people go through our platforms. We have a platform and they can do that gap analysis. And also what we find very interesting is being able to understand what has worked and what hasn't worked, and to share those best practices with other lotteries within the industry to help them not just achieve the certification, but then continuously push to go beyond and to do more and to do better.
And I want to talk as well about the role that the industry have in working and educating the customers, because they obviously have a huge customer base. And one of the interesting things I took away from the recent European Lottery Sustainability Conference was on recycling of lottery tickets, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but we've talked a few times about paper and the fact that these lottery tickets are printed on thermal paper, which I'd always suspected that receipts weren't recyclable, but not quite sure whether to put them in the recycling bin and causing issues at the recycling plant. But just to confirm for everyone, Laura, pretty much lottery tickets are not recyclable, I believe.
So it depends which part, because it depends. So some scratch cards, for example, some are not. Some lottery tickets where you just write your numbers usually are, and then the thermal paper that you get, it depends. Basically, it's but this is where at that meeting there was a lot of questions being asked to the suppliers of the industry, and asking them to provide the kind of paper and resources that are secure. That's very important, of course, but also that are perhaps either recyclable or are at least printed on sustainable paper, so which comes from sustainable forests.
Is there a role there for the industry to be educating consumers about, how they can help reduce the carbon footprint or be more sustainable in their actions?
100%. 100%. This is what I mentioned earlier when I say, okay, there's the impact of the company on society, but then there's also the incredible resources that a company has that they could use to do something positive. So if you think about state and national lotteries around the world, typically they are the companies with the highest marketing budgets of any other companies in the country. Typically, they also have the highest reach because they have they sell through retailers all over the countries, and they have the highest reach. Very often they have one of the highest brand awareness as well in the country. And of course they give money to good causes, but they have one of the key thing is their reach. They, especially lotteries, they are played by 60, 70, 80% of the adult populations in some countries. So if it can use this access and this reach to inspire people to make the right choices when it comes to environmental impact, not in, of course, a kind of a motherly way, but in a way that's fun, that's exciting, and if it can be inspired, that it is sexy and cool to make the right decision when it comes to environmental impact, that's just huge. That they have the possibility to do something absolutely wonderful. And so some lotteries have tried. So FDJ in France have just launched a scratch card which aims to Number one, raise money for biodiversity. I believe that the paper that's being used is as environmentally friendly as can be, not perfect. And they also use this way to educate retailers and players around environmental impact.
So, Laura, you've been in this space for as long as I can remember anybody been in this space on
God,
the sustainability
not
side.
that long.
Well, it hasn't been, around for that long. So let's assume that
It's been a
you've
little
been
while.
around since kind of like the early emergence of the sustainability practice within the gambling and lottery industries. What has changed, and is there anything that's really exciting you about your job right now?
Yes, I don't have to convince people that it's important anymore, or I still do, but not as much. Specifically, the environmental piece. So I think, you know better, but like safer gambling, it's getting more traction, and there's more interesting things happening. And it's the same when it comes to environmental impact as well. And I am so excited by some of the new recruits in the company that I work with, who are very often junior people who are pushing, the C-level execs of doing more when it comes to environmental impact. So I think that kind of intake of new employees recently really excite me. The second part is things like the European lottery sustainability guidelines that aim to try to help the industry beyond just them, but help the industry understand their impact, share best practices, share ways to measure what works and what doesn't. That I'm also excited by. And yeah, it's going in the right direction. It's not fast enough. This industry is still way behind what I do in other industries, but it's coming, and I'm really excited by the potential influence and reach that this industry actually have. So if we can try to convince a few of those companies to use that influence to really have a positive impact, that would be phenomenal. So I'm really excited by that.
And I want to really thank you for your contributions and efforts. Before we finish up for today, I was hoping you could be able to share with everyone watching how they can get in touch with you or anything you've got upcoming. And I also have a question about research. We do have a lot of researchers who tune in to this webinar. Where do you see the biggest gaps? As you say, one of the important things of the first steps is actually working out where is the baseline. So what is your call for any researchers or early career researchers planning their studies that you would like to see more information on?
Yeah, so another thing I'm excited by is when I work with researchers. So as I mentioned to you, Dr. Kitania, for example, is one of the researchers I work with. I think one of the things that I like to see is the translation of research into concrete actions that the industry can really implement and try and report on, and then continue to improve and so on. So that's one of the pieces of work that we're doing with Maris, where we're trying to translate some of that research into actionable, let's say, resources or tools for the industry. And yes, I'm just hoping that there's more researchers who will look at the life cycle analysis of products in this industry from an environmental point of view, or will look at how we can look at the environmental possibilities from a positive impact point of view. How can we use the resources of that industry for positive environmental change? So I'd like to see more of that, but of course, that's what I would be excited by.
Well, Laura, I want to thank you for joining us this week, and of course staying up late, as we always seem to ask all of our European guests to do so. We very much appreciate you sharing all of your insight, and that was a fascinating discussion. So thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you to both of you, and I really like your webinar. So continue, and have a lovely day. Take care.
Well, thanks
Thanks
so
much. And Laura
Bye.
as well has agreed to tune in with myself in Sydney and Kahlil in Seattle. And Laura is joining us from a remote part of Portugal. So appreciate any technical difficulties with the connections. We had a few teething issues, but hopefully the content has been worthwhile enough for everyone to continue. And thank you everyone for joining us on the Technology Risk and Gambling webinar. Next week, we are at a special showcase of our early career researchers who are around the world tour of all the upcoming emerging superstars in research from the leading labs and the leading supervisors. We're turning it over to the people who will be talking about these much longer than us, who are shaping the world. So make sure you do tune in for that. Kahlil, any final words from you?
I just don't know how we're going to fit everybody next week into a single hour. It's going to be.
I've done the timing. They get 4 minutes each.
Challenge.
So
Okay, perfect. That's it for me. See you all next week.